welcome to Canonical. I'm James Xiao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris
Hey.
and Sam Spieler.
Hi.
Hi, Sam and Iad. Today, we are reviewing the first book in our campus novels series with Donna Tartt's 1992 debut novel, The Secret History. Since this is a review episode, we won't reveal any spoilers. And if you haven't read the book yet, keep on listening. If you want to join our discussion, you can find us on Reddit by searching for Canonical Pod, one word. And we are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Let's talk briefly about campus novels. What is a campus novel?
So what I think is the defining feature, obviously, is that it happens in or around a college campus. It's actually more common in fiction than you might imagine. A subgenre related to the campus novel is the academic novel, which tends to focus on the professor more than the student. I think these novels are interesting, and the reason why I thought it was good to have a series on these is because there's an obvious appeal to the reader because it's nostalgic. It reminds us of our formative years. But it's also interesting on a more serious level, I guess, because it has an easy way to access themes. The students are going through this kind of liminal state where they're becoming adults, and they are approaching these big ideas about how to live a good life and what love means and all of these big ideas. And their approach to these things is purer and more uncomplicated. So I think for writers, it's an attractive way to get at themes in a not necessarily an easier way, but a more direct way. I also think because universities are connected to all sorts of different disciplines, it's a very flexible setting for a novel. Writers can really connect the campus novel to anything else that they want. And then the last thing I think that's appealing is that there is always a tension between the quote-unquote life of the mind that you would associate with a professor and the real world that we live in our day-to-day life. And I think there's always a tension between the way we think about things and the way we actually live in the world.
Well, let's focus in on this book, The Secret History. Let's all do an elevator pitch. Imagine you're Tartt's agent or you're introducing this book to somebody. What would you say to hook them?
I think I'd say something like it's a murder mystery set among stuffy highbrow elites, except it's not really stuffy and it's not really a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Sam, what if I hate highbrow elites? Those are my least favorite elites. Do I still want to read this book?
It depends. So it's not about highbrow elites per se. In fact, the main character is from a working class background, and he lies his way into this literary and elite seeming world. Even though he seems like a smart character, he's definitely rushing to catch up with the people around him.
I think a lot of novels will have these kind of snooty characters, and for the book to work, the author expects you to sympathize with them. And in this novel, I don't think Tartt necessarily requires you to sympathize with the characters. So even if you don't like elites or you don't like highbrow classics studying kind of pretentious college students, you can still like this book.
Yeah, because I don't think the characters are especially likable. Even though you are interested in them, I don't think that you necessarily want to be friends with them.
No, and she plays with that quite a bit. She plays with what you expect from these characters and turns those things over and over as the novel progresses.
Well, my elevator pitch or description would be, imagine that you're having high tea with the smartest person you know, and they start telling you why they murdered a friend in college.
The only thing I would change about that is before telling you the interesting bit, they would include 500 pages of things that don't seem relevant.
Yeah, I think it's relevant. Yeah. I mean, I do agree that the beginning is slow, but it's the most intelligent person you know, so no matter what they talk about, you're kind of interested.
I'm being only half serious here. I do think that for most readers, it's going to seem a little bit bloated, but I think that all of the stuff that's in the novel works, but it doesn't have to be in the novel. It just adds to the novel in a removable way. It's not functional text. It's more aesthetic text, I guess.
So this was my pick for our series. The Secret History, as James said, is Donna Tartt's debut novel, published in 1992. She studied at Bennington College in Vermont and graduated in 1986, alongside some other notable figures, such as Jonathan Lethem, who wrote The Fortress of Solitude, and Bret Easton Ellis, who is the author of American Psycho. Bennington is important because our novel takes place in the fictional Hampton College, based heavily on Bennington and her time there. It follows Richard Papin, who is a working class boy who escapes a family and life in California he can't stand in search of beauty and a fresh start in New England, to the extent that he lies about his background, constantly adding to his elaborate fabrication of being from money in order to fit in among his new rich friends. Those friends, Bunny, Henry, Francis, Charles, and Camilla, are all part of this very small, tight clique of sorts who are studying classical Greek under the sole supervision of Julian Moreau, who is this benign but somewhat enigmatic figure with a background of mythic proportions himself. It starts off with a prologue that is a really interesting way to begin, because Tartt gives us not only the main crux of the novel, which is the death of a major character, as well as the mention of the guilty parties, but also suggests some themes that take the whole book to roll out. There are many interesting themes here, but we will get to those in our discussion episode next week.
I think that Richard is actually connected to Tartt herself because her experience in Bennington is very similar to Richard at Hampton. She went to school at Bennington, but she transferred from the University of Mississippi. She was there for her freshman year and then was recommended to transfer, which I don't know is really a flattering thing for your teacher to tell you, yeah, you should probably go to another school. But yeah, she left and went to Bennington, and that's when she met Bret Easton Ellis and Jonathan Lethem and all of those people. But I think it's interesting because you have this perspective of a middle class or even maybe working class person in this new setting, but you also have the setting of another geographical region coming to New England. And I think New England in general, but Vermont specifically, it has this specific culture to it, you know? And it's not hostile to outsiders, but it's so distinct that I think the experience of an outsider is relevant. And I think that's what Tartt was able to bring to this novel.
I would say, though, yeah, I think it is a compliment if that teacher is Barry Hannah, I believe. And he also, I believe, said that she was a genius at age 18. So that's a feather in her cap.
Yeah, it's not bad to be a genius, but I don't know. All right, well, let's get into it. What do you guys think of this book?
I really liked it. It's well written, and originally I felt it was long. And it is. It's more than 500 pages. But the characterization is the best part of this, I felt. The development of the characters really brought me in. And I can even pinpoint, I'm curious if this was true for you guys. I can pinpoint exactly when my interest started picking up.
Okay, when?
In the first lecture of Julian's, when he first starts speaking to all of them. And he's going into what ends up being kind of the basic underlying premise of the book and Richard's time at college, that sublime beauty is inherently dangerous and terrifying.
And you really liked it because it reminded you of your dating days?
Exactly. No, it was just, it went from being the story that was from a odd, almost indifferent point of view. I couldn't really pinpoint how I felt about Richard. And then all of a sudden you have this character, Julian, who, when you first meet Julian, he's this weird, secretive guy who blows Richard off and doesn't want to deal with him. And then we see him in action leading his class. And you understand why it's so exclusive and why the few people in his class really want to be there.
Well, I agree with you, Sam, and I'm going to add on to it a little bit. I'll make a statement now, which I think might be controversial for us because we have a habit of critiquing award-winning novels. This is my backup elevator pitch. I believe that this is the perfect novel. When I started it, I thought, okay, it's a bit slow. I'm not that into it. But when I finished it, I was really convinced this is the perfect novel. I see no flaws. I think everything is done at a super high level. It's so well executed. The plot is great. The characterization is great. The tension is great. The setting is great. I literally have nothing critical to say about it as a novel. I think it's perfect. If this landed on my desk as an editor, I don't think I can make any critical comment about it as a novel. I might make a comment about where it fits on that commercial to literary spectrum. I have some thoughts about that, but for it functioning as a novel, I think it's perfect. I wouldn't touch a thing.
Interesting. I don't really know how to react to that because I really enjoyed it. It's not my favorite book or anything, but I also know that's not what you mean. And yeah, the idea of a perfect novel, since it's not my perfect novel, is I'm trying to comprehend that in my head.
I would say it's very, very strong, but there is something that I would fault it for. I think that the pacing slows in maybe the third quarter. After the murder has taken place, there is kind of a slowing down when the characters just kind of descend into alcoholism, which I felt was fine. It was establishing mood and establishing theme, but those moods and themes had already been established, and I was waiting for something else.
It's kind of a classic 5-act setup where you've got a sort of climax in the third act, which is alluded to from page 1, and then it dips. And after that dip, it builds again to the final climax. It felt very classic to me, even though I didn't really see how it was going to unfold. In retrospect, it makes sense the way it slows down and everyone descends into this drug and alcohol fueled depression.
Well, let's talk more about this being perfect, because perfect is a very, very strong word. And Sam, you said that you know what James means by it, but I'm quite curious. When you say perfection, that kind of tacitly assumes that there is such thing as a perfect book. What do you mean? Is it just perfect for you or perfect in some other sense?
I'm just looking at it as an editor. How would I improve this book? I don't think this book can be improved. I don't really agree with that third quarter being slow. I thought it was fine, and I actually found it really suspenseful. When I think over the book, I don't think there's anything I would cut out. I don't think there's anything I would add. I don't think there's anything I would even amend. It's all there. But I want to specifically say it's perfect from a craft storytelling point of view. I think it's not necessarily a perfect novel if we're trying to judge it as art. I'm talking about it as a story. When you look at plot, characterization, setting, how it pulls the reader through, the way different scenes weaved into each other, the way sentences work together, the sentences are really good. Just on that level, it's perfect. But I'm not necessarily making an argument about it being a perfect work of art because I don't think that's possible.
Well, this is something else that we can talk about, because I would say another thing that it lacks is a hook at the beginning. This is something we talked about, or at least I mentioned during the discussion of The Vanishing Half. When we were reading that novel, I felt that the beginning was a little bit flabby. It didn't hook me right away. I didn't care so much about the characters. In the same way, even you admitted that when you were reading the beginning of the book, you weren't so interested right away. So in retrospect, the beginning works, but during the act of reading, it didn't work. Is that a fault or not?
No, I don't think it's a fault because I didn't stop reading. You know, some books can have a very exciting beginning. For example, Station 11, where a person dies. I wouldn't fault it. I would say that it's slow. But a slow beginning can still be fine. Like, it can still work. Not everything needs to go at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't advocate it for 100 miles per hour. I think there are speed limits in fiction if you want to be tasteful. You don't have to hook somebody with something gratuitous or salacious, but there is a feeling sometimes that it could have been more hooky, not necessarily in an obvious way, but in a more thematic way or a more sophisticated way. But I don't think in general it's a huge problem. And I think that, well, there are things in this novel that don't seem immediately relevant to the overall structure of the novel. They belong in the novel because I think mood, much more than anything else we've read so far, mood is really important in this novel. I don't think that the characterization or the plot or anything is as perfect and watertight as what James is saying, but because Donna Tartt spends so much time creating mood and creating ambiance, I think it's kind of like a fog that fills in all of the cracks of the novel. And it just works so well because you have such a clear idea of what the weather is like and what the scene is like and how people are feeling at that moment, that it overpowers any other potential flaws in the novel. And I think that's what justifies the 500 pages that this novel takes up. Just to give the listener an example, in the beginning of the novel, before the main event is described, there's a lot of discussion of them hanging out together and eating dinner together and socializing, and it does seem a little bit empty, but I think the mood that is established by that is really important. What it establishes is the stakes, and later on, when everything turns to shit, it feels much more important because you have an experience of all of the good times that they had together. I think that if we cut out some of the happy times, the darkness of the second half wouldn't feel as dark.
Well, and there's that turning point, too, where Richard is not one of them until suddenly, and very importantly, he is.
And I thought that was quite moving as well. I mean, it's not overwrought, but at the same time, you understand his loneliness. You understand that he really wants to be a part of a group, this group specifically. And it's contrasted by all the invitations from Judy Poovey and the people not in the group. And this kind of contrast I also think is really interesting. The contrast of this kind of sublime atmosphere of the classics class and his dorm mates who go to these crazy parties, get high and drunk, just like his in-group does as well, but they're viewed as being lesser than. But his friends are the ones who are doing a terrible thing. So that kind of tension is really interesting.
One thing I want to share, and I'll link this in the show notes for the reader, I found an article written by a classics scholar, and the title of the article is something like, "So This Is What They Think of Us," and it was a review of this novel, but from the perspective of somebody actually in the field. She was very upset with Donna Tartt and the way Tartt represented the exclusivity and the kind of uselessness of studying classics nowadays. But for all of that rejection, I don't think the author was able to actually refute it. She was just able to be upset by it. So the case for not studying the classics, I think, is made in this novel, and I don't think even the classicists are able to refute it.
Let's take a break now, and when we come back, we'll talk about where this novel is on that spectrum between literary and commercial. Welcome back. I talked earlier about where we would place this novel on that literary commercial spectrum. So, for example, literary novel might be something like James Joyce's Ulysses, and a commercial novel might be something like Dan Brown or Danielle Steele. Where would you guys put this book on that spectrum?
It's kind of genre breaking in an interesting way, as we've already discussed. It's somewhere in the middle because I think it appeals to a lot of the commercial side, but it does have literary aspirations, and not just aspirations, it delivers. So somewhere in the middle, but I don't know exactly where. More to the literary side.
So if a 0 is Angels and Demons and a 10 is Finnegan's Wake, I would say that this is probably like a 6 or a 7. I think it gets a few points extra because it has all of the ancient Greek stuff and all of the classical references. But to be honest with you, I think a lot of that is just window dressing. And it might sound like it's kind of criticism, but I don't think it's criticism actually, because I think it's unimportant. I think that those things are decorative and they work, and that's enough. It has other things that work for it.
Well, it goes to the mood that you were talking about before. It's window dressing in the sense that it adds to the setting and to your understanding of these characters. But it, like you said, it's not important to the understanding of what's happening.
The only thing I would say that would require having these classical references is that it is substantial that they're studying classics. Like, what they're studying has to be elite. It has to seem useless. It has to seem exclusive. So if not classics, maybe like modern poetry or something. Not to diss all of my friends in the modern poetry world, but it has to seem something like the average working man would have no time for. That's the functional aspect of it.
Oof, Knives Out. Those poets would be flying to Beijing if they had any money.
I think classics works better than poetry because I think classics, it's both useless in the sense that you were talking about, and there's this grandiose nature to it.
Yeah, the classics people are the people who look down on the people that other people get looked down on by. You know? Like they're on the top of the mountain of sneering.
Sure.
For me, it's really difficult to say where I would put this novel. And I think the difficulty stems from the fact that, like you said, it alludes to a lot of ideas. It kind of touches on it, but it doesn't really explore it to the point that leaves me feeling very satisfied. But at the same time, I am really convinced that Tartt is a genius. I would say that, I'm just not getting it. I'm not getting all the references, and I'm not getting all the ideas that she's put in the novel. There's a lot about fate here, and that's very Greek and classical. And you get that feeling from the very beginning that these characters are fated to act in this way. There's this feeling like they actually do not have any real agency, that what's going to happen is unavoidable. That's very interesting, but I don't know what to make of it necessarily.
I think I understand what you mean. I think I'm getting everything I need to get, but there might be things I'm not getting, and I don't know if I'm not getting them.
Right. Like, I think there's this quality of feeling very disjointed. Everything flows really well, but these parts of the novel that flow well don't necessarily flow well with each other. So, for an example, the language that the characters use is very odd. They kind of talk like English people, British people, but they're not. The novel itself is written in kind of like a 19th century way, which is also strange. It doesn't go with anything else really, but it creates this kind of atmosphere of feeling displaced.
It wasn't until the introduction of Judy Poovey where I realized, oh, okay, this is modern day, or at least this is the 80s. Yes,
that's exactly what I'm talking about. See, when you read that, you feel displaced.
Right, especially with Bunny. Bunny is the first person of that group that you hear speaking, and his way of speaking is very loud. And the way he speaks is like this guy from the 50s or 40s, a way that doesn't exist anymore, or doesn't exist in any person that I've ever met.
Yes. And that is very interesting because if you kind of probe it, then you can say, well, this is what classics is, right? It's this kind of vernacular or this kind of conversation about something that doesn't exist. And these are people who are talking about this, and they talk in a way that doesn't exist. Henry talks in Greek.
Right. That's also a veneer, though, that gets more and more pulled back the farther into the story you go.
Yes. And that's what I mean. I feel like if you kind of probe it, you think, oh, okay, at first I thought this is nothing. But then when you think about it, you think, oh, there is more here. And then you end up, being a cultist in the cult of Donna Tartt, right? And you start thinking she's a genius. The way she's done this is brilliant. It all kind of works, though if you just look at it on a surface level, you just kind of feel like, huh? Why is she doing this? That's why I think it's so interesting. So for me, this is what makes the novel literary.
I would disagree with you there. I think that at its core, it's a very humane novel. I think that the main interest of the novel is a depiction of a young man discovering who he is and what kind of person he can stand to be around. And I think that those are very common topics. And I think that that seems like it would not be very literary, but because it's done so well and with such depth, that's what makes it substantial and literary.
Is this a Bildungsroman for you yet?
In a sense, I mean, it's not all the way there because it's cut in a very specific place. And I think that that cut is an important feature that a lot of Bildungsroman don't have. I don't want to spoil anything, but I think that there is a progression in Richard that doesn't mature, doesn't go from the beginning to the end in a linear way. I think it cuts very abruptly, and I think we can talk more about that in the next episode.
Well, stay tuned next episode then. That's when we will continue this discussion. We're going to conclude here. Thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit at CanonicalPod. We regularly post threads on Reddit for discussion. We'd love for you to join us there. You can also find us on social media at CanonicalPod. That's CanonicalPod, one word. We'll be back next week with an in-depth discussion. And if you're interested in joining our discussion, go ahead and find a copy of this book if you haven't gotten it already. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.